Hello and welcome to a new run of Ways to Change the World. You might well have noticed that we have been effectively off the airways for the last few weeks since the coronavirus crisis hit, and we couldn't work out how we could do the podcast if we couldn't do interviews face to face, because we became really obsessed by sound quality and image quality and all of those things. But the world has massively adapted. We've all become really used to seeing people interviewed on Skype and all sorts of other platforms, and so we decided to give it a go. And so forgive me if the technical quality isn't as good as what you're used to, but we will try and do our best, and so will our guests. And my first guest this week is not only sort of very technologically savvy, so hopefully this will be a good one. He's a brilliant and gripping author and historian. Rutger Bregman has just brought out this. It's called Humankind, A Hopeful History, a perfect book for these weird times that we're in the era of coronavirus. Now, Rutger, of course, burst into our consciousness, I suppose, last year when he went to Davos and shook things up by talking to all these rich millionaires and billionaires about their taxes. And how everything else was nonsense. He's also written some big stuff that we will talk about later on, and he's one of the big arguments, or sort of people who argue for universal basic income, and he's often quoted in that particular argument. Again, really interesting given where we're at economically in Britain at the moment, with so many people being furloughed and paid for by the government. But Rutger, welcome. You've brought a big idea at just the right time.
Thanks.
And you begin this book with what you say is sort of a simple big idea. What is it?
It's a very simple idea. It's in fact that most people deep down are pretty decent.
Why do you say that, and why is that the starting point for a big book?
There's been this very old and deep theory within our culture, within specifically Western culture, that goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks, and that you find with the Christian church fathers as well, and so many of the Enlightenment philosophers. And that is, I think, embedded at the heart of our capitalist system, which says that most people are selfish, and that our civilization is only a thin veneer. And that especially during times of crises, supposedly we human beings reveal our true selves, and we become nasty, and we become very selfish, and the animal and the beast comes out in each and every one of us. And I think that is fundamentally wrong.
I mean, it's the basis for so many bits of philosophy. I mean, you start with sort of the Hobbes and Rousseau sort of opposition. Just explain that.
Yeah, so Thomas Hobbes, a British philosopher, had his famous book, The Leviathan, one of the most important works in political philosophy, incredibly influential. And so his view was that back when we were still nomadic hunter-gatherers, we lived these lives that were nasty, brutish, and short. And there was a kind of war of all against all going on. It was like a terrible life in the state of nature. But we somehow got out of this by sort of electing or choosing a Leviathan, a very powerful guy. It's usually a guy, sort of a king or a monarch who keeps each and every one of us in check. That's really dominant. The selfish view of human nature is so often used as a legitimization of hierarchy, right? Because if we cannot trust each other, then we need a Leviathan to control us. Now, Rousseau, the French philosopher, had the opposite view. He said, no. Actually, the state of nature, we lived lives that were pretty good. We were relatively healthy, we were free. But then came civilization, and that's when everything went wrong. We started living in villages and cities and doing agriculture, and our health deteriorated. The age of warfare began. And so this is the big debate in philosophy that's been taking place for centuries. Was Hobbes right, or was Rousseau right?
And the truth is, we're somewhere in between, aren't we?
Well, that's sort of the usual boring, dull answer. I at one point, yeah, at one point I had the idea of calling my book "Rousseau Was Right." Right. The interesting thing is that so often Hobbes is seen as the realist, right? He's described as the father of realism, and still today we often equate realism with pessimism and with cynicism. If someone comes along and says, I've got these dreams, I've got hopes for the future, then we often say, well, be a bit more realistic, where we mean, be a bit more cynical. And so Rousseau has often been described as this romantic French believer in these dreams that will never come to pass. What really struck me while researching this book is that if you look at the latest state of anthropology and archaeology and hundreds of scientists, doing all this path-breaking work, you're like, but this is pretty much what I read in the Discourse on Inequality, that Rousseau wrote in the 18th century. I'm not saying he was right about everything, but he was sort of right when he said that civilization, for the biggest part of the history of civilization, was actually a disaster. Our health deteriorated, war started, we got hierarchy, we got patriarchy. It was a really bad decision.
And what you've done is you've gone through a load of sort of examples of stories, some of which people may think they know, which you then sort of debunk slightly. And the one a lot of people will have seen in the newspapers was the real Lord of the Flies. And you concluded from one example that if you leave a bunch of kids on a desert island, they don't all turn into savages.
And it's obviously, it's not a scientific experiment, right? It's just one example that we have. The only thing that I'm saying is, if millions of kids still have to read Lord of the Flies in school, then let's also tell them about that one time that it actually happened. It's the only time in all of world history that we know of that kids actually did shipwreck on an island. And it's the happiest story ever. It's a story of friendship and of comradeship and of cooperation. People wouldn't believe it if it was fiction. They would say, well, it's very sentimental. But here we are. It really happened.
So what actually happened for those who haven't seen
So you've got 6 Tongan kids. Tonga is an island group in the Pacific Ocean who are bored with school. They're at an Anglican boarding school, and they don't like the school meals. They don't like all the homework. So they're like, you know what? We're going to go on an adventure. This is 1965. They make a big mistake on the first night. They're in the boat and they fall asleep. Then there's a big storm, and so they drift for 8 days. Then they shipwreck on this small uninhabited island that, people haven't lived there for, more than 100 years. And they managed to survive there for 15 months by cooperating really well. So they form teams of 2 to tend to the garden, 2 to cook, 2 to be on the lookout for ships. Sometimes they're in fights, but then one of them would go to one side of the island and the other to the other side of the island, cool off a little bit, come back and say sorry. It wasn't like they were having a fun time. It was very hard. Sometimes they were very hungry or thirsty. But then after 50 months, they were rescued by an Australian captain who was just by accident fishing there. And they became the best friends. Also with the Australian captain, they started to work for him. And so 50 years later, I managed to track down 2 of those real Lord of the Flies kids. And they had lived happy and fulfilling lives.
And that's not the only example you found, is it, of people not descending, into chaos, hatred, and violence? Basically, you're saying that people themselves are kind of nice and dull.
Sort of, yeah. It's what biologists call survival of the friendliest. So what has happened for millennia is that it was actually the friendliest among us who had the most kids, and so also had the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation. And this is really what explains the success of our species. If you ask the question, why us? Why have we conquered the globe? And why didn't the Neanderthals do it? Or the chimpanzees or the bonobos, right? Why did we do it? The answer is that we're really good at cooperating. Individually, we're not that smart. If you do an intelligence test and have a human toddler compete with other animals like a pig, for example, usually the toddler loses. But what we can do is we can really cooperate on a scale that other species just can't. And our bodies are designed to do this. So, for example, one fascinating thing is that we have got really special eyes as human beings. So I can see you looking at me right now, and that is because you've got white, and I've got that as well. We all have that. We've got white around our eyes, right? Which means that we can sort of follow each other's gazes, right? You can see what other people are looking at. All the other primates don't have this. They have dark around their eyes. It's a little bit like they are poker players wearing shades, right? But we just give away our gaze to everyone, which makes it much easier to trust each other.
What have you thought, looking at our current state of being in Britain during the coronavirus lockdown. I mean, again, we're in sort of really uncharted territory. Some people would have predicted chaos, that there'd be mass civil disobedience. There's no way people would live by the rules for more than a week or two. That people would be angry. Hasn't really happened.
It reminded me so much of what happened in Britain on the eve of the Second World War. So before the bombs started falling on London and other cities in the UK, elites were really panicking. They thought, you know what, people are going to go nuts. The Germans will break the British morale very quickly, and then the population will panic, and the army will have its hands full controlling the masses, right? They can't even fight the enemy because they'll be too busy at home. That was the fear that people like Churchill really had. Then what happened is that the bombs did start falling, and the opposite happened. The keep calm and carry on spirit came over London and other cities, right? There was this wonderful British humor and jokes. There were sort of the buildings destroyed in cafes and restaurants, and people would put out signs in front of them that said more open than usual. And it didn't have a big impact on the economy. Actually, war production increased. And then the question was, how do we explain this? Because especially in 1942, the experts had to decide, what are we going to do with our Air Force, right? Are we going to bomb the Germans, the cities, or focus on strategic targets, railroads, or, I don't know, industry or something like that? And so they thought that the response from the British population was typically British. It was the British spirit, that must be the explanation. But the Germans, well, obviously they were, had a very weak moral character, so it would be easy to break their spirit. And then they bombed Germany 10 times as heavily as Britain. And, exactly the same thing happened again. The cities that were bombed the heaviest actually became more resilient and saw increased wartime production compared to cities that were not bombed or not bombed as heavy. Because it wasn't British culture, it was human nature. This is just how people behave during times of crisis. They pull together. So now we have seen this epidemic, the corona crisis, and it's literally the same playbook. It's, again, Downing Street and the experts saying, you know what, people will get tired of this. There will be this fatigue, with the lockdown. And that was one of the reasons why the UK was slow to go into lockdown, because they thought the public couldn't handle it. And look what it has cost us, in terms of lives. So this is the problem over and over again. When elites think about human nature, they look in the mirror and they assume that other people are as selfish as they are. But that's not the case. Power corrupts, but most people are pretty decent.
Why have we then spent 70 years still thinking that there's such a thing as British exceptionalism and not really understanding that it's everybody?
I think that's another truth about human nature, and it's a darker truth, right? It is that we also have this capacity for tribalism and group behavior, right? It's the dark side of friendliness. So on the one hand, I'm saying that human beings have evolved to be friendly, but then sometimes that friendliness is exactly the problem, right? We sometimes do the most horrible things in the name of comradeship and of loyalty. I thought it was fascinating to discover that actually empathy and sort of xenophobia are often two sides of the same coin, right? You feel empathy for your own group, for your own people, and then you distrust the outgroup. This is the dynamic that plays out again and again in our history.
Well, I mean, if people are sort of fundamentally nice, I mean, we kind of have to address, the bad stuff. Why do bad things happen? Why do bad people exist? And, and also what you just mentioned, really, which is the elites being selfish, useless, whatever it might be, venal. What's going on there? I mean, let's start with, you have to, and you do it in the book as well, where you talk about the 21st century ultimate European evil remains the Nazis and the Holocaust. Yeah. So where does that fit in to your theory of human nature?
What's interesting is that after the Second World War, there was this whole new generation of social psychologists. People will have probably heard of, Philip Zimbardo with his famous Stanford prison experiment, or Stanley Milgram with his studies he did at Yale, where supposedly people were willing to shock random strangers, give them very dangerous electric shocks. And so the message of those scientists back then in the 60s was that, how do we explain the Holocaust? It's because there's a Nazi in each and every one of us, right? So it was the return of veneer theory. It's just below the surface. We're all capable of it. Now, I think that is wrong. I take a lot of time, in the book to criticize those experiments, but then still, you got to ask yourself the question, how is this possible, right? How do we get there? Now, what my most important objection is to these kind of psychological experiments is that they trivialize our history, right? You can write libraries full of books about the very complex historical process that led to Auschwitz, right? And there are so many different things at play here. The role of distance, for example, the technologies that played a role, the sort of brainwashing that was going on at the same time, how evil became normalized year by year by year. But obviously, I mean, as I said, libraries full of books. I felt that these sort of psychological experiments trivialized the Holocaust because they're like, well, there's an easy explanation. There's a Nazi in each and every one of us. Well, it's not as simple as that.
Well, then take us to the next part of the argument.
So one important thing that we have to talk about is the role of distance in the history of violence. So we've all watched way too many series on Netflix and HBO and, Game of Thrones and you name it, that give us a depiction of violence as if it's easy, as if and we can all do it. That's absolutely wrong. We can't do it. We know, for example, or most of us can't do it. We know from historical research that only 15 to 25% of Allied soldiers during the Second World War were actually capable of firing their guns. It's just, there's a very strong tendency in our psychology that at the moment that we have to do this, we can't do it, especially if the enemy is really close. Bayonets, for example, most bayonets throughout history have never been used. And the reason is quite simple, because it's just psychologically too hard. If you look at the Battle of the Somme during the First World War, of the Battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon was defeated, almost all of the wounds were not caused by bayonets. Almost none of them were caused by bayonets, but it's almost all of artillery. Because it's much easier to push a button and then have an explosion far away, right? So then we can actually be violent. So distance is sort of a way to overcome this. Not only sort of physical distance, but also psychological distance. So we can also dehumanize the other. And I mean, it's a terrible truth about our species that we are capable of this, but I'm just saying that it doesn't come natural to us. It's not easy. I mean, sex is easy, right? Most of us like it and love it. Food is easy, right? It's perfectly understandable why it's good for us and why it's good for the body. Violence, actually, when people kill someone else, for example, when soldiers come back from wars and they've killed someone else, they've also destroyed something within themselves, right? They are traumatized, they often have PTSD, etc., which suggests to me that we're not born to do this, even though we are capable of it.
I mean, that explains, I suppose, some of the mechanism as to how you get armies to do bad things. But I mean, I suppose we still have to kind of work out the thinking behind it, don't we? We know that somebody somewhere has bad thoughts, or that all people have bad thoughts to some degree, and how that squares up with what you're saying about our basic nature.
Yeah.
Is it that we all have good and bad thoughts, and the good naturally overpowers the bad in most cases? Or
I sort of have a double view on this. So on the one hand, I'm saying that your view of human nature is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what you assume in yourself and in other people is often what you get at. If you assume that most people are selfish and aggressive, then you'll design your society in such a way that it will bring out the worst in yourself and all of us, right? You'll design your company in a way that you'll get a lot of cutthroat competition and people will behave, in a very nasty Hobbesian way. And you'll do the same thing at schools and prisons and maybe our democracies as well. And I think we can turn it around, because if we have a more hopeful view of human nature, we can start designing our institutions in a very different way, more egalitarian, where we actually rely on the intrinsic motivation of people, to make the world a little bit of a better place. So that's one thing. The other thing I'm also saying is that we do have sort of two legs, sort of the social leg and the selfish leg. And, it's the question is which leg do we train? But we also have a natural preference, that is deeply embedded in our evolutionary history for the social leg. And this is something you clearly see how people behave during crisis, They have an intuitive response that is all about solidarity and cooperation, right? They don't really have to think about it. It's just what they immediately do. And that is exactly what has made our species so successful.
I mean, have you worked out yourself where because a lot of this is sort of belief system. It sounds quite religious in a way, sort of what you believe about good and evil. What's your own background on that front? How religious are you?
So my father is a Protestant minister. So I grew up in a religious household, not very strict in any way. I mean, he's a free thinker. He's a bit of a philosopher himself. But yeah, then you have this moment as I think so many of us have when you're 17 or 18 years old and you're wondering, what should I believe? Which dogmas are true? Did Jesus die on the cross for my sins? Is there a God? Is there life after death? And that was the moment when I became an atheist. It was only later, and also while researching this book, that I became sort of less interested in the question, is this or that true? But more interested in the question, what is the effect of us believing this or that? So what is the performative power of ideas?
But it's so like a religious book in a way that you've even come up with your own 10 commandments, haven't you?
Couldn't resist, sorry.
Yeah. 10 ways to live your life in a good way. I mean, can we just go through them?
Sure.
10 rules to live by. The first one
when in doubt,
assume the best.
I mean, so often when we communicate, we don't really understand each other. I mean, even though human beings have been designed to cooperate and communicate and connect, we make a lot of mistakes here, right? So, for example, on WhatsApp, you get an emoji and you're looking at the emoji and like, what does that mean? And then often when we are in doubt, we assume the worst. We think that someone else has bad intentions. I think that's a bad strategy for a couple of reasons. So in the first place, most people are pretty decent. So when you assume the best, you'll be right most of the time. In the second place, if someone doesn't really mean well, then your behavior, your positive behavior, can have an effect that psychologists call non-complementary, right? So someone does really nasty against you and you behave in a positive way, and then the other one is like, oh, well, maybe I should change my behavior as well, right? Human beings are mirroring each other all the time. So if you're having a good time together, then you're friendly to me, I'm friendly to you, and that can go on for a very long time. But it also goes the other way around, right? You can also go in a circle of nasty behavior. The way to break that is to go against your intuition and to be nice to someone who's not nice to you, which is, as I said, non-complementary behavior. Now, then you can say, but wait a minute, Rutger. There are still like con men out there, right? There are still people who want to rip you off. And then I'm saying, yes, that's true. And we can't change that fact. And it's just collateral damage. You should accept it. Because what's the alternative? Do you want to live your whole life distrusting everyone around you just to make sure that you'll never be conned? I mean, that's a way too high price to pay. It's much better to say, okay, I accept that a couple of times in my life I'll be conned by the very tiny majority of people who do this, and then can live a full life trusting other people. I think that's a good price to pay. And I mean, the alternative, if you've never been conned, then you should ask yourself the question, what's wrong with me, right? Is my basic attitude to life trusting enough? Maybe I should visit a therapist or something.
Do you leave your doors unlocked at night, I wonder? I mean, this reminds me of my conversation with my Australian family, my wife's family, who all leave their doors unlocked at night and don't seem at all worried about anything. And it's totally unimaginable because not only do I bolt 3 bolts across my door at night, I put the burglar alarm on and I go upstairs.
Well, I mean, you don't have to be totally irrational about it. For example, I lived in Utrecht, one of the big cities in the Netherlands where people on average own, 2 or 3 bikes. So everyone has a lot of bikes. And of course I lock my bicycle there, right? Because there's just a small group of people who often, have difficult backgrounds or are addicted and are stealing bike after bike after bike. I mean, I'm not saying that you shouldn't lock your bike or anything. But I am saying that you should be really careful about being too distrusting of other people and worrying about being ripped off all the time. Because maybe, it's just a price to pay.
Number 2, think in win-win scenarios.
Yeah. So very often when we sort of talk about doing good things, we think that people have to suffer for it, right? And then someone does something nice and but that's just for his or her career or LinkedIn profile, or just because it gave him or her a good feeling, right? Because people just want to be a do-gooder. And I'm just like, But what would the alternative be? Would we really want to live in a world where every time you do something nice, you get this nauseous feeling, right? That you feel terrible? I mean, what kind of hell would that be? I mean, luckily we live in a world where doing good also often feels good. I mean, that's what evolution has done for us. That's pretty great, terrific news, right? Yeah, I think that very often sort of the best deals work for both sides. As you mentioned earlier, that I've written quite a bit about universal basic income. One of the things that I really like about giving the poor free money is that it is an investment that pays for itself, because you have to spend less on healthcare costs and judicial costs and police costs and you name it. It's really an investment with a great return. And I think that's the kind of view we need to adopt here.
Okay, number 3 is ask more questions. Why does that help?
Well, we talked about this, that people may get the impression that I've written this happy clappy book about follow your intuition, etc. I think that's not a good idea. Empathy can very often be a bad guide, right? That we sort of think that we know what the other person is feeling, but in reality, we often don't. So then it's often just better to ask a question. I also give the example of the golden rule, right? How do you say it in English? Like, do not do unto others what you don't want to be done unto yourself, right? And then the other formulation as well. Yeah. I think what's wrong with the golden rule is that it assumes that you know what the other person wants, right? You don't know that. And the other person may be different from you. So there's also the platinum rule. George Bernard Shaw had a great expression. Maybe you can read it from the book because I don't know it by heart. It's the last line there.
Yeah. Do not do unto others as you would that they should do unto you. Their tastes may be different. Okay, number 4 is temper your empathy, train your compassion.
Well, we talked a little bit about this. Empathy often works as a spotlight, right? As a searchlight. As you focus on the one person or group that you care about, the rest of the world fades into darkness, right? And empathy is just very limited. You can't feel empathy for everyone. You can't just do that. And psychologists emphasize that compassion is different. It's a bit more, you take a bit more of a distance, right? It's a bit more detached. It's a bit more rational. And you sort of don't feel what the other person is feeling, but you do feel with that person. And there's even a real difference in the brain here. So when people feel empathy, a different part of the brain lights up than when they feel compassion.
Okay, number 5 is try to understand the other, even if you don't get where they're coming from. And I guess you have to kind of go to extremes on this, don't you? Mm-hmm. I have to try and understand the Nazi. I have to try and understand the racist.
And it's so important to make the distinction here between understanding and condoning. Because if we understand why young men blow themselves up, right? Why they kill themselves and killing a lot of other innocent people in the process. If we understand that, then we can maybe try and make sure that it doesn't happen again. Right? That's not the same as condoning it. And what experts emphasize is that very often these, for example, the foot soldiers of terrorist organizations, they're not motivated by a strong grasp of the ideology, right? There were a lot of people who went to Syria who had very little idea about sort of the Islamist faith. Some of them had books with sort of Quran for dummies, in their backpacks. So why did they do what they do? Well, the terrible truth is that they often did it out of friendship and out of comradeship and out of this finally having this feeling of belonging to something, of finding meaning in your life. Again, this is not about condoning. It's about understanding, because if you understand that, I think then there are ways to design the most effective counterterrorism programs to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And what are those most effective counterterrorism programs? Well, they're often the opposite of what we do, right? So often we think that you have to sort of really crack down and expand the surveillance apparatus and that kind of thing. But if you look at the most effective counterterrorism programs, well, you go to somewhere like Denmark, where they have this outreach program to drink tea with people who are potentially about to be radicalized, and offer them a job and a conversation, etc. Now, I know this sounds all very sentimental and naive, but for example, Aarhus had this moment where they tried this, and before that, they had like 35 people going to Syria. The year after that, it was just one. So there's a huge amount of scientific evidence that this kind of approach, where even treating potential terrorists with a certain kind of compassion, it just has better results. And again, not about condoning anything. It's about understanding.
Okay. Number 6 is love your own as others love their own.
I think we also have to sort of accept that human beings are limited creatures, right? We just can't love all of humanity. That's not what we're capable of. I mean, some Buddhist philosophers or meditators pretend they can do it, and then they have meditated for 50,000 hours or something like that. And then they say, oh, that's an example to us all. But I'm like, I don't have 50,000 hours. I want to live my life, right? So I think that in a certain way, it's acceptable that when there is a terrible attack, say you live in London and there's a terrible attack in London, it's acceptable then that you sort of feel more empathy for that than if there is a sort of terrible thing going on 10,000 miles away, right, in some other distant country. That's who we are. We are limited creatures. The only thing that we have to remember is that those people far away are human beings just like us, with the same human nature.
Why does that help us, though? Why does that help us be better people?
Well, look, for example, at the, classic example is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I mean, it's this terrible cycle of empathy and then vengeance that goes on and on and on. So there's an attack, and then one group feels real empathy for the victims, and there's like, okay, we need vengeance, and then boom, an attack on the other side, and then, empathy, and it goes on and on and on, right? But it's sort of the same dynamic that is at play on both sides. And sort of you tend to forget that, what drives you is often what drives the people that are so distant from you as well.
Okay. Now we get to the difficult one. Number 7 is avoid the news.
Yeah. The news is...
You're really down on the news.
Sorry. Well, just to make sure, I make a distinction between the news and journalism. Not all journalism is the news. The news is really about the sensationalist, the incidental, the stuff that makes you a bit depressed. There's even a term for this in psychology. Psychologists talk about mean Walt syndrome. So people who've watched too much of the news have become more cynical and depressed, etc. So it's not good for you. It's a bit like a drug.
But are you sure that's true if you take our current example with coronavirus, in which you say people on the whole are behaving well, and people are obsessed with the news? News audiences are massive, and people are just being informed.
Yeah. It's understandable because we're living through history right now, right? So it's obviously very important to know what's going on. But then sort of the daily numbers about the number of deaths and infections and how full the hospitals, do we really need to know all of that? I think that often it makes people more anxious and depressed and doesn't really help them in their lives, right? But then,
doesn't it help people work out what's gone wrong? And where their leaders may have made mistakes, which is also important.
And that's investigative journalism, right? That helps us to zoom out and to focus at the bigger structural forces that govern our lives. So what I always recommend to people is just, start with the Sunday newspaper. Just read that the rest of the week. Make sure you finished it, right? And then sort of ignore the breaking news, ignore the sort of the push alerts, etc., etc. You can easily do without that.
Number 8 is don't punch Nazis.
Yeah. So there's a certain kind of activism, Rebecca Solnit, one of my favorite authors, once remarked, that is more, that cares more about sort of being right, or sort of feeling good about being right, than about actually achieving results. Sort of this moral righteousness, you see that often. So I think I get in the chapter I give the example of sort of left-wing activists who like to punch Nazis, and it's like, we're fighting fascism. And then my question is that really the most effective approach, right? Because when you drop a bomb on the Middle East, that's often, the best way to recruit more terrorists, right? It sort of really fits the narrative of those who you're saying you're fighting. The same is with punching Nazis, right? It's probably a great way for Nazis to recruit more Nazis and for them to give to really feel this feeling of being oppressed. You can turn this around. So there's one town in Germany, what's it called? Wunsiedel, that sort of did the opposite. And they when they had a Nazi march of neo-Nazis every year in their town. And so they said, you know what, we're going to make this some kind of benefit march for the good cause. So they promised that for every 10 meter that the Nazis donated, or walked, they would donate a certain amount of money to a group that helps neo-Nazis get out of, those kind of groups. I think that is just hilarious, and it's just a much better way to try and reach out.
Which takes you on to number 9, which is come out of the closet, don't be ashamed to do good.
So I'm a fan of the film Love Actually, right? And that is, it takes a lot of courage to say that as a man of 32 years old, right? It's often very sort of, people find it hard to come out for the good because they're afraid that they'll be dismissed as sentimental or naive, or that you're a do-gooder, you're just doing this for the money or for your LinkedIn profile or something like that. The difficulty here is that when you do not come out for it, then you'll put it in quarantine, right? And then it cannot spread anymore. We know that human behavior is contagious, right? Not only viruses are contagious, human behavior as well. Just admit it. You just like the movie, especially the beginning with, the part about Heathrow, where all these happy people are hugging each other. You just like it. Just admit it. Okay,
finally, be realistic. Now, some people may think, well, that's a bit of a downer to end on, isn't it?
No, it's the most important thing, actually. What I'm trying to do in this book is to redefine what it means to be a realist. The realist is someone who has hope for the future and who has a more hopeful view of human nature. I think that is entirely realistic. And it's the cynic who's really naive and who needs to update his view of human nature in line with the latest scientific evidence.
So why did you write this? I mean, why did you? It's a big topic to sort of broach. What brought you?
It's a hopelessly hubristic book, right? I think that everything starts with our view of human nature, right? Every political philosophy starts with it. And then if we look at the greatest challenges that lie ahead of us as a species, and maybe especially climate change, how are we ever going to do anything about it if we don't believe in ourselves? If we believe that people deep down are just selfish, then it's never going to work out. So also, if we just want to survive and live sustainably on this planet, I think we need to start with just looking at ourselves in a different way.
Do you, also enjoy throwing the odd hand grenade? I mean, when I think about that sort of session in Davos, I watched a little bit of it again this morning. You went into this elite playground and sort of, basically sort of stuck two fingers up at them all. Was that the plan?
Yes, that was very much the plan. Well, actually, it was. I knew that on that Friday, this all happened on Friday, the last day of the conference, that I was going to do a panel that was televised and where I had the opportunity to plug my book and try and sell more copies, right? And then the day before that, I was in my hotel room and Skyping with my wife and saying how horrible I found the whole experience of being at the World Economic Forum. I'm not really a networker or anything, and so I spend a lot of time actually in the hotel room itself, I must admit. But I said, you know what, I just have to do this speech tomorrow or this panel, and then I'll go home. And she said, but come on, are you really going to do that? Come on, you got to say what you really think about the whole thing. And then I said, okay, maybe you're right. So I prepared this short speech about, how this is a firefighters conference where no one's allowed to talk about water, right? No one's really talking about taxes, what we actually got to talk about. And that didn't do much, but then over the weekend, or I think on Monday, it totally exploded on the internet. So that was a strange experience. But I think it sort of also reveals the paradox of this book. It is that even though human beings have evolved to be friendly, sometimes that's exactly the problem, right? Very often progress comes from people who are willing to be unfriendly and go against the status quo and to be nasty and just say what they think, right? That often helps us. And if you go to Davos and you expect some kind of conspiracy and these elites, sort of scheming to take over the world, you'll be disappointed, but because you'll discover that actually these elites are really nice and you'll have nice conversations with them. And that's especially that is worrying, right? It is. And they mean well, and still they don't pay taxes. So someone has to tell them the truth, I guess.
Let me just talk to you briefly about universal basic income as well, and see how you think that argument has shifted. Because when you were talking about it, and you've got a famous TED talk, it's had a lot of views, talking about it, it's still something that people were basically writing off, saying, yes, it's sort of, even people that were thinking, well, it's quite a nice idea in theory, it's quite simple, I like its simplicity, but it would cost too much, and it's just kind of crazy. We're now in a situation in Britain, for example, where the state or the taxpayer is effectively paying for half the country, or taking on that liability at the moment because of the furlough scheme, in which 80% of people's salaries are being paid for in millions of jobs, and also the public sector. It is in a way a universal basic income. They've capped it at £2,500 a month. So do you think this is now an argument that's kind of come of age? And do you think that that is effectively what they're doing, or are they not doing the universal basic income and doing something much more complicated because they don't want to admit that they were wrong?
Well, you have to look at the whole basic income discussion and see it on a spectrum, right? So you can make the current welfare system more basic income-ish, right? You can make it a bit, you can remove some conditions, you can make it more universal, right? You can make it more in the spirit of a basic income. So if we'll ever have a basic income, then I think that's how we'll get it. Just, a lot of small steps that will get us there.
But do you still think a universal basic income is the way to do it? Or do you think these more complex instruments that are sort of just coming up out of crises effectively do the same thing, and that's fine?
I think that after the crisis, what I would want is not only like high quality public healthcare, and I think another essential ingredient is high quality public education, but also a floor in the income distribution. That is really what a basic income is about. It's not a net, but it's a floor, something that you can always rely on, right? It's just a right that you have as a citizen. Venture capital for the people, so that everyone can decide for themselves, whether they want to start a new job or create something new. That's sort of what I envision as the ultimate goal of what I just see as social democracy.
And should that floor be at a comfortable level, or should it be at a difficult level? Because how do you stop people just saying, okay, I'll
somewhere in
just
between. So it should be enough to pay for your basic needs: food, shelter, education, bit of clothing. But almost everyone would also want to have additional income on top of that. The reason actually, or one of the reasons why I started working on Humankind, was that I realized that the idea of a basic income presupposes a different view of human nature. It presupposes that people can actually be intrinsically motivated. They don't always only work because someone else says they have to do it, or because of the money or whatever, but because they have their own dreams and ambitions. Yeah, I think that if you really want to believe in basic income, then you also have to need this different view of human nature.
I always sort of end the podcast by asking people if they could change the world one way, by waving a magic wand.
Oh God, that's such a
how
hard
they
question.
would do it.
The thing that moved me the most while I was researching this book was, at one point I had the privilege of visiting a school in the south of the Netherlands that had sort of completely reimagined what a school can be like. So no more homework, no more sort of rooms, no more sort of strict schedules or curricula, no more tests, no more grades, just relying on the intrinsic motivation of the kids, and then mixing it all together, all the ages together, all the levels, academic levels together. And what touched me the most while I was there is that there was no bullying going on. They designed it in a very different way. And that made me realize, actually, and there's a lot of sociology to back this up, that the way we've designed schools now, especially sort of the typical strict, maybe let's say the typical British boarding school where the kids of Lord of the Flies went to, these are designed to bring out the worst in us from a very early age, designed to bring out more competition and nastiness. If I could change the world, I would start there, with just creating different environments for our kids, because you have, then you'll have very different individuals who want different things from life. Yeah, indeed.
That's a whole podcast there. We could do another one on. Rutger Bregman, thank you very much indeed for sharing your ways to change the world and talking to us about Humankind, a hopeful history. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, then please do give us a rating and a review. This podcast is produced by Rachel Evans. Until next time, bye-bye.